Hello and welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Donicic. If you haven't already, subscribed to our channel to stay in the loop. Now let's get right into our story today, which takes us to the island nation of Japan. Now, Japan recently held its general elections, which were on October 31st. Now, a lot of you will be saying, oh, that's kind of old news, Dennis. That happened at the end of last month. But the reality is that the consequences of those elections are finally becoming visible today. Namely, newly re-elected Prime Minister Fumio Kishida was re-elected by the Japanese parliament. Now, just to understand things, I'm not going to go and explain the entire Japanese political system and the specific dynamics of how their government functions, but the people of Japan do not directly elect their prime minister. Instead, they elect members of parliament. And usually these members of parliament represent a political party. Now, this political party then in the parliament votes for their prime minister. And whichever candidate gets the most amount of votes becomes the prime minister of Japan. Now, keep in mind that Fumio Kishida has actually been serving as prime minister, however, only for about a month. Last month, on October 4th, he was elected by the Japanese parliament to become the successor of Yoshida Suga. Now, Yoshida Suga is a member of the Liberal Democratic Party, and so is Fumio Kishida. They are both presidents of this party, which has been in charge of Japan for a very, very long time, since the days of Shinzo Abe. Now, Shinzo Abe is still today universally considered to be one of the best prime ministers in Japanese history. Despite his ultra-conservatism, he was able to lead Japan into a good source of development, a relevant place on the international field, and develop a lot of strong foreign relations for Japan and its government and its place in the world. Now, what happened to the Liberal Democratic Party was actually kind of unfortunate. Shinzo Abe would have a series of health problems due to his advanced age and would have to retire from the position of prime minister. Shinzo Abe's successor, Yoshida Suga, only served as prime minister for a year. Now, I'm not going to go into the complexities of Yoshida Suga, but he's widely unpopular in Japan. Now, Suga did not really have a lot of ability or opportunity to have a lot of influence on Japanese politics, change economic policies, or really do anything for Japan because he was exclusively focused on maintaining and controlling the coronavirus pandemic, which has been affecting the entire world. Now, in Japan, his handling of the coronavirus pandemic was viewed as genuinely really, really bad. Specifically, his decision to host the Tokyo Olympic Games, despite there being major concerns of a coronavirus outbreak, which did occur because of the hosting of these Olympic Games, would lead him to become extremely unpopular in the eyes of the Japanese people. Now, Yoshida Suga would do the honorable thing and resign himself. He would not seek to keep being prime minister, and when he resigned, his successor was elected by the Liberal Democratic Party. And this gentleman is the current prime minister, Fumio Kishida. Now, the reason that Fumio Kishida was selected is by the Liberal Democratic Party. He was viewed as the most conservative and safe option for winning re-election and for guiding Japan and for maintaining political popularity. And that's actually what he managed to do. Now, the elections that occurred on October 31st were actually not supposed to be a victory for the Liberal Democratic Party. They were supposed to be a major loss following after the prime ministership of Yoshida Suga and pretty much mishandling coronavirus. They were not supposed to win re-election. Not just was coronavirus an issue, but a lot of other political parties were popping up on the scene. Mainly the far-right Ishin Party, which comes from Osaka, and different really left-wing parties that were promoting and pushing for change in a stagnant Japanese economy. Now, despite these odds, Fumio Kishida, because of his general popularity, his relatively centrist viewpoints with a conservative leaning, and his economic policy and ideals, was able to actually lead the Liberal Democratic Party to a victory. Now, the LDP won 261 out of 465 seats in the lower house of the Japanese Diet. Now, keep in mind, the Japanese Diet, the National Diet, is actually separated into two houses, an upper and lower house. Now, despite it being called the lower house actually has significantly more power and is much more politically relevant to Japanese politics than the upper house. Because of this victory, he was able to become reelected by the parliament to the office of the prime ministership. Now, let's talk a little bit more specifically about Fumio Kishida, the campaign promises he made to the Japanese people, his general political viewpoints, his stances, what made him popular, and how his prime ministership could turn out and what it means for the world. Now, Fumio Kishida, as I mentioned before, was relatively popular. This is a career politician who has actually served in multiple ministries in the Japanese government. He's well known by the Japanese people and very well liked, being extremely communicative, funny, charming, charismatic, able to present his case. And what really helps him shine was the fact that he's a centrist, but does have some ties to right-wing political groups inside the LDP, specifically those tied to popular former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Now, the Japanese people tend to be very centrist and very moderate. Now, that being said, most Japanese people and most Japanese voters tend to vote slightly more conservatively. They're not hard right, they're not hardcore fanatics, but they like to be a little bit more right-wing and conservative in the politicians that they choose. And this ability to walk the line between moderation and right-wing is what really helped Fumio Kishida, even before his prime ministership, become popular in the hearts and minds of the Japanese people. But what really pushed him forward was his idea of new capitalism. Now, Fumio Kishida has publicly stated and openly believes that neoliberalism and modern-day capitalism have become irrelevant and have led to massive economic inequality and have completely destroyed the middle class. Now, Fumio Kishida is a capitalist and believes in a free market, believes in investments, believes in rising incomes, believes in consumer spending. These are key ideals of capitalism, but believes that there has to be some form of growth and wealth distribution. Now, I can't get into the specific complexities of his new capitalism ideology. That would require an entire episode, but basically it works like this. Kishida believes that politically, the Japanese economy needs to have stimulus given to it. So money needs to be put into the economy to increase incomes and to increase investment. And this increase in investment and income will increase consumer spending and increase more investment, which can let the government have more stimulus packages to give people more money and to inject more economic activity into the economy. Basically, growth, redistribution, growth, redistribution, growth, redistribution. It's an endless cycle that leads to endless growth and endless redistribution. And he's already begun this plan. On his first day as prime minister, he plans on, in the National Diet, pushing forward legislature of a 30 million yen stimulus package. Now, 30 million yen is roughly 265 billion United States dollars, to give you just some idea of how massive this stimulus package is. This stimulus package includes cash payouts, just giving money to everybody so they can spend more and to give them more spending power and to give them a generally better life. And the entire thing that drives the ideology of new capitalism is the belief that there is a lower class and they're in an unfortunate position, and there is an upper class who's extremely wealthy and is just becoming more and more and more and more wealthy, while the middle class is getting smaller and smaller. And this is a reality in pretty much every single Western country that has neoliberalist capitalist policies. And people are becoming to get sick of it. Late-stage capitalism is no longer as popular as mid-stage capitalism was, where anyone could become wealthy. Now, his entire belief is to grow the Japanese middle class and to give them a stable standard of living where people know that they're going to be able to work, they're going to be able to be paid well, they're going to have enough of an income, they're going to be able to invest and have a general future. This made him very popular in the eyes of many Japanese voters who before pretty much had the choice of voting for people that supported old neoliberal capitalist policies or more radical far right-wing or far left-wing movements that just completely took things off the hinge. This kind of centrist approach to modern-day capitalism, while also incorporating redistribution, was very well received by the Japanese people. And he is going to carry out policies that are going to lead to growth and redistribution. Now, that being said, a lot of this new capitalism proposal involves a lot of government spending, and it involves a lot of stimulus packages and increasing investments and increasing income. Now, that probably is good, and it will probably be good for the Japanese economy. But one thing needs to be kept in mind. When you go towards extreme growth, and especially when you put a lot more money into the economy, during times of inflation, this can be bad. Even when there's not inflation, this naturally causes inflation on its own. Now, what needs to be kept in mind is we are globally in an inflation crisis. Inflation is happening all over the world right now. Prices are increasing virtually in every single developed country on earth, from the United States to Germany to pretty much every European Union country to Latin America. Inflation and prices are growing, and that could actually be problematic with this new capitalist policy. And when Kishida implements this, his administration implements this, inflation has to be strongly monitored to ensure that it doesn't get too high. And the reason for this is, let's say you have an income of $50,000 a year, and 10 years from now, you have an income of $80,000 a year. You would probably feel happy, right? Your income has increased by 60%. But let's say that prices have increased by 100%. You are actually poorer than you were before when you had $50,000 a year. Now, that is a very basic example, but that is what could happen in a much more complex way in the Japanese economy and to the Japanese class if the new capitalism policy is not properly administered and policed. Now, finally, I want to talk about his foreign policy. In terms of foreign policy, Kishida is actually a lot more conservative than other major Japanese politicians, specifically when it comes towards the rival nation of China and the threat that is North Korea. Now, keep in mind that militarism and spending a lot on military development in Japan is actually a very taboo topic. In fact, Japan is constitutionally, legally not allowed to have a military force. It can have armed forces for its own personal defenses, but it cannot have military forces that can be used for attacking other nations or carrying out preemptive strikes. This is in the Japanese constitution. However, the reality is Japan has a very large defense force and a very large armed forces. And this was actually expanded by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and most Japanese people support this. They didn't before, but they support it today. And this is because of the growing threat that is China. China is a rival country to Japan. Both nations have a very complicated history with one another. Both nations have carried out atrocities on one another, and the history and the blood is just genuinely bad. And China is a rival of Japan and vice versa. While China has been growing militarily, Japan has not. And Japan has to be able to meet the threat that is China. On a much lesser note, but still relevant note, there's also the threat of North Korea, which has been, in recent months, increasing its missile tests and its nuclear testing. There are major threats in the region that Japan needs to focus on. And Kishida has not only proposed increasing Japan's defense capabilities, he is also, as a former prime minister, and he did this while he was the foreign minister of Japan, a major pusher for U.S.-Japanese relations, especially as they revolve around military cooperation. And more specifically, he is a huge supporter of the Quad Dialogue. Now, the Quad Dialogue is essentially an informal military alliance or strategic dialogue between four countries in the region: the United States, Australia, India, and Japan. These four democratic countries signed a pact that they believe that freedom, democracy, and peace and the defense of democracy are the best way to counter authoritarian countries in the region. India, Japan, Australia, and the United States work together using joint military practices and having a prepared alliance to counterbalance the influence of authoritative countries in the region, most notably China. That is the biggest threat. And he is a huge supporter of the Quad dialogue. So we can expect under his prime ministership for there to be a lot more cooperation between Japan, the United States, Australia, and India, and an increase in military alliances or strategic alliances in the region to counterbalance Chinese influence, which for the United States is a very good thing, for Australia is a very good thing, for India is a very good thing, for the European Union is a very good thing. For China, it's not. If we're looking at it from a Chinese perspective, this military union or this informal strategic alliance is actually creating more tensions in the region. But in the eyes of Japanese voters and the Japanese people, it is one of the best ways to protect their interests and protect their nation. So that's what can be expected. More strategic alliances and more military cooperations in the region. Now, finally, I do want to comment on his social issues. Now, social issues and social political stances are not something that I genuinely like to talk about on this podcast because I think they're not very relevant to international politics or global affairs, but nonetheless, it's worth commenting on it because the guy just became prime minister and some of the things that helped him get elected were his conservative social stances. Most notably, Kishida has actually been a major opponent against a law that would change Japanese marital law. Now, under Japanese marital law, when a couple is married, there can only be one surname that is used, which typically means that when women get married, they have to legally drop and get rid of their matron name. Their old family name has to be removed and replaced by their husband's name. Now, Kishida has stated that this is a part of Japanese culture and it's a sign of respect from the wife towards her husband. And I actually agree on the last part. I'm not going to comment on Japanese culture. I'm not Japanese. You might have noticed that. But I agree. I think that having this conservative sense socially is actually a good thing and it maintains society in the way that it is. In addition to this, he has been an opponent of diversity legislation. Now, diversity legislation is actually very common in the United States or in other European countries. Basically, these are laws that state that in places like boardrooms that run companies, universities, etc., there has to be roughly a 50-50% proportion of men to women. Now, Kishida believes that women nor men should have any kind of inherent advantage in life and that they should only achieve the positions or achieve the success that they have based on their own qualifications. Now, I also agree on that. And we can debate social topics, we can debate social issues. I prefer to talk about global affairs, but if you disagree with me, let me know in the comments. But let's just summarize our report today. Japan has a new prime minister. He's already been prime minister for a month, but in that month, he's not had a lot of time to initiate his campaign promises and his policy ideals. We're going to see if they work. A lot of the things he's promising they look very good, and they look like they're going to have a positive impact on Japan. Now, they may not, and he could potentially fail just like his predecessor, Yoshida Suga, and have to resign in a year. Or maybe he ends up becoming like Shinzo Abe and becoming one of Japan's most prominent prime ministers. Thanks for tuning in. Let me know what you think. How do you think Kishida's prime ministership is going to do? What is the future of Japan? Let me know in the comment sections. See you next time.